The central nervous system is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. The brain has four basic regions. We have the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. The cerebrum and the cerebellum are divided into right and left hemispheres. The brain is organized around a central cavity. Immediately outside the central cavity is gray matter, and then there is white matter. In the cerebrum and the cerebellum, we have an outer layer of gray matter. This is referred to as the cortex. This disappears as you descend down the cord. The ventricles are the fluid-filled cavities of the brain. They're continuous with each other and with the central canal of the spinal cord. They're filled with cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, and they're lined with the ependymal cells, which are one of the neuroglia. There are two lateral ventricles, which are housed in the cerebrum. The third ventricle is in the diencephalon, and the fourth ventricle is between the pons and the medulla. The lateral ventricles in the cerebrum, the third ventricle in the diencephalon, and the fourth ventricle housed between the pons and the medulla and sort of crunched in against the cerebellum. The fourth ventricle is continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. The cerebral hemispheres are the most superior part of the brain, making up about 83% of the brain mass. The gyri are the elevated ridges on the surface of the brain, and they're divided by sulci, which are shallow grooves. The deeper grooves are known as fissures. The longitudinal fissure separates the cerebral hemispheres, and the transverse fissure separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. The cerebrum is divided into lobes that are separated by deeper sulci. We have the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes that are named for the bones under which they lie, and then the insula. The sulci that divide the lobes are known as the central sulcus. This helps divide the frontal and the parietal lobes. And we have two gyri. We have the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. These are very important landmarks on the brain. The parieto-occipital sulcus separates the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. The lateral sulcus helps separate the temporal lobe from the parietal and the frontal lobes. The insula, or the fifth lobe of the cerebrum, makes up the floor of the cerebrum. The frontal lobe is the forward part of the brain. It's under the frontal bone. It's divided from the parietal lobe by the central sulcus. In front of the central sulcus, we have the precentral gyrus, and behind it we have the postcentral gyrus. Here's the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe. This is the cerebrum, which is a different part of the brain. As we separate the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, we can see the insula, which is underneath these lobes. There are three basic regions to the cerebral hemispheres. The cortex is the outer gray matter, then we have the underlying white matter, and then we have basal nuclei. These are inner gray matter that's situated deep within the white matter. The cerebral cortex is the area of consciousness. Structural differences in the cerebral cortex have been mapped and are known as Brodmann areas. There are three functional areas of the cerebral cortex: the motor areas, the sensory areas, and then the association areas that help link sensory and motor areas together. The cerebral cortex has contralateral control. The right side of the brain controls the left side of the body and vice versa. The cerebral cortex is symmetrical, but it shows lateralization. That is, specialized areas will develop only on one side of the brain. No functional area of the brain acts alone. The cerebral cortex acts as a unit. The motor areas are going to control voluntary movement, and they're in the posterior part of the frontal lobe, in this red area. We have the primary motor cortex, that is in the precentral gyrus. Just in front of that we have the premotor cortex, the frontal eye field, and Broca's area. Now there are several other motor areas in here, but these are the four we're going to talk about. The primary somatic motor cortex is located in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. It has pyramidal cells. These are very large neurons, and the axons of these neurons are the ones that are going to extend down the spinal cord. They're going to make up the corticospinal tracts of the spinal cord. This part of the brain allows for conscious control of precise, skilled skeletal muscle movement. This is the kind of thing you think about. This is your voluntary muscle control. Somatotopy is the mapping of the brain, and here is the precentral gyrus, and this is the motor cortex. The more muscles we have to control, or the more precisely we have to control those muscles, the larger area of brain it takes. So our face, we have a lot of muscles and we have a lot of fine control, so the face takes up a big chunk of brain tissue. The hand, another thing we finely control. But your foot, not so much so. Your trunk, not as much fine control there. The premotor cortex helps plan movements. This is the staging area for skilled motor activities. It's going to coordinate with the primary motor cortex. It helps control learned, repetitious, or patterned motor skills. This is where your typing skill lays, or if you play a musical instrument, it's housed here. It controls the voluntary actions that depend on sensory feedback. For example, if you're searching in your pocket for something, as you feel things in your pocket, you either rule those out as the keys you're looking for, or you pull them out as the key you're looking for. That requires sensory feedback for you to take that action. A couple of other motor areas in the cerebral cortex are Broca's area. This is usually in only one hemisphere, and it's usually the left. This is your motor speech area, and it directs the muscles of speech production. It's also active when we prepare to speak. Then the frontal eye field controls voluntary eye movement, that movement you make when you want to follow an object. If we have damage to the primary motor cortex, we will lose voluntary muscle control. However, reflexes will stay intact. A stroke in the right hemisphere in the motor area would lead to paralysis on the left side of the body since the brain is contralateral. If we damage the premotor cortex, we lose programmed motor skills. The muscles will still work, but we lose the ability. So if you knew how to type and you have damage to the premotor cortex, you can't type anymore, but your fingers can still perform the tasks. You have to relearn the process. The sensory areas of the cerebral cortex are your conscious awareness of sensation. The primary somatosensory area is in the postcentral gyrus. Then we have a somatosensory association cortex that's posterior to that. Visual areas reside in the occipital lobe, auditory areas in the temporal lobe. The olfactory cortex is found in the frontal and the temporal lobe, your gustatory cortex in the insula. The visceral sensory area is near the gustatory cortex, and the vestibular cortex is in the insula. In front of the central gyrus, we were primarily dealing with motor function. Behind the central gyrus, we have our sensory function, with the primary visual cortex here, our auditory cortex in this area, and so forth. The primary somatosensory cortex is in the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. It's going to receive general sensory information from the skin, from proprioceptors of the skeletal muscle, from your joints, from your tendons, things like that. It's also going to provide you with what's called spatial discrimination. It helps you identify the region of the body being stimulated. Again, we see contralateral stimulation, so the right controls the left. More of the cortex is devoted to areas with many receptors, like the face and the fingertips. So going back to our map, here is the sensory cortex in the postcentral gyrus, and you can see areas where we have very fine sensation, like our face. We have a big chunk of the brain devoted to that. Our hand, another area, but our trunk, not so much so. The somatosensory association cortex helps integrate sensory input, things like temperature and pressure that come from the somatosensory cortex. The information from the somatosensory cortex is used when we're trying to identify objects without looking at them. This does draw on memory. We remember feeling that particular shape or that particular texture, and that helps us identify the object we're holding. If we have damage to this area, we lose the ability to tell what something is simply by touching it. We have to see it in order to identify it. The visual areas are found in the occipital lobe. The primary visual cortex receives visual information from the retina of the eye. The visual association area then interprets that visual stimuli. We are able to recognize objects. We're going to use past visual experiences to help interpret the current visual stimuli, color, form, movement. When you look at something that you don't recognize, you start thinking about all of the things it looks like, and that is how you eventually identify the object that you're viewing. If you have damage to the primary visual cortex, you will have functional blindness. You'll be unable to see. But if you have damage to the visual association area, you'll be able to see, but you won't be able to identify what you're seeing. The auditory areas are located in the temporal lobe. The primary auditory cortex receives auditory information from the inner ear, and they determine its pitch, rhythm, and loudness. The auditory association area stores our memory of sounds and helps us perceive what we're hearing. Is this speech? Is it a scream? Is it music? That's what the association area does. The olfactory cortex is located in the frontal and the temporal lobe. This helps us with our awareness of different odors. The gustatory cortex is located in the insula and helps us perceive taste. The vestibular cortex takes care of equilibrium. It's found in the posterior part of the insula and helps us be aware of our balance. And the visceral sensory area helps us with the conscious perception of visceral sensations. Normally, we don't feel what goes on in the organs, but if we have an upset stomach or a full bladder, that's the kind of information that gets to the visceral sensory area. The association areas are communication between the sensory and motor areas. This allows us to give meaning to the information that we receive. It also allows us to store this information in short-term memory, tying it to previous experiences, and it helps us decide on what we're going to do with this information. The sensations, the thoughts, the emotions all become conscious. It makes us who we are. There are three broad parts to the association areas. We have the anterior association area, or the prefrontal cortex, the posterior association area, and the limbic association area. The anterior association area in the prefrontal cortex is the most complicated. Here is where resides our intellect, our complex learning, our ability to recall. This is where our personality resides. It contains our working memory, the stuff we need when we're dealing with abstract ideas, things we can't see that aren't concrete in front of us. This is where our judgment resides, our ability to reason things out and to continue to try to reason things out. Also, this is where we plan what we're going to do next. This area develops slowly and is not fully mature until you're in your early 20s. It requires positive and negative feedback from the social environment. Failure to get this, and you have people who have poor judgment, poor reasoning, never make good decisions. Tumors or lesions in this area can lead to mental and personality disorders. There's a loss of judgment, a loss of attentiveness, and inhibitions are lost. People start making bad decisions and losing all inhibition. The limbic association area contains the cingulate gyrus, the parahippocampal gyrus, and the hippocampus. This provides the emotional impact that makes a scene important to us. We may see a car accident on the side of the road, but unless we recognize the car, while it may be tragic, it doesn't impact us directly. The hippocampus helps store the memory of an event. The posterior association area is scattered through the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes. It plays a role in recognizing patterns and faces and help localizing us in space. It makes us aware of the entire scene, everything that's going around us all the time. It also provides us with attention to location of a part of the body. If there is a lesion in this area of the brain, the individual may fail to recognize a part as part of the self. They'll think that left foot doesn't belong to them. As a result, they may fail to care for that part of the body. Lateralization is when one hemisphere dominates a task. The left hemisphere typically dominates language, math, and logic. The right hemisphere, more visual spatial skills, the artistic and musical skills, it's more your emotional brain. Cerebral dominance designates which hemisphere is dominant for language. In 90% of the population, the left cerebrum is dominant. 10% of the people are right cerebral dominant or share dominance equally. They tend to be left-handed males. Those who have equal domination are ambidextrous. A problem with not developing a clear boss of the brain here is learning disabilities. Dyslexia, where people reverse the order of letters and words, and ADD may be the result of failure to develop a dominant hemisphere. As you look at your left brain and your right brain, the left brain is the very organized part of you, and the right brain is more free. It's more artistic. There should be connections back and forth so that you can exchange back and forth between the two hemispheres of the brain. Some people are very left-brained. Some people are very right-brained. Most people are fairly balanced in whether they're left-brained or right-brained. Here's a little trick to see if you are left-brained or right-brained. If you look at this, there are two possible pictures you can see. Some people will only see one and will fail to see the other even when it's pointed out to them. One picture is you're looking at a young girl. Here's her eyelash, her cheek, her fur collar, a necklace, and this is her hat. The other way you can look at this is an old woman. Here is her nose. This is her mouth. Again, she's got a fur collar. This is a scarf over her hair. Here's her eyes. There's a little dimple or pimple she has. The other eye is over here. If you can see both of them, then you're pretty balanced brained. If you can only see one of them, even though the other one has been pointed out to you, you're probably a little more left brain. The cerebral white matter are the myelinated fiber tracts, and we have three types of tracts in the brain. Hemispheres connect corresponding areas of the two hemispheres. The corpus callosum is the major hemisferal fiber in the brain. Association fibers connect adjacent gyri of the same hemisphere, so association fibers are either in the right or the left cerebrum. And projection fibers enter and leave the cerebrum. They help connect the cerebrum to the lower nervous system. So your association fibers, adjacent gyri, are connected. The commissural fibers connect the right and the left hemispheres, and the projection fibers leave the brain. They come from the cerebrum and come down the spinal cord. Here you can see the gray matter on the outside. This would be the cortex, and here's the white matter with those various fibers in it. The basal nuclei are several structures, including the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. These are little clusters of gray matter in the white matter of the brain. They receive input from the cerebral cortex and from each other. They're able to send input to the premotor and prefrontal cortices via the thalamus. This helps influence muscle movement. The exact function of the basal nuclei is difficult to determine. They seem to be important in starting and stopping movement and in monitoring the intensity of movement. They're involved in sustained stereotypical movement. For example, you swing your arms when you walk. That's probably a function of the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei also seem to be involved in inhibiting antagonistic movements or unnecessary movements. They help provide us with smooth muscle movements.